Hello everyone, welcome again to today's AIRAH webinar. Today's Streamline is brought to you by AIRAH and Ecolibrium. This webinar looks at the NCC 2019 with specific regard to the number of ways Section J compliance with the performance requirements can be demonstrated. This is also the last webinar of the case study series as well. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please pop them into the Q&A section and hopefully we can get through as many questions as we can at the end. So I'll now pass things over to Grace, who will be our presenter today and taking you through the session. So thank you, Grace.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's pretty tough to see that we have quite a big turnout for these Streamline sessions. Today I'm going to be going through the last of our case studies series that has been published in Ecolibrium. And today we're talking about verification methods that's available to you under Section J. For the agenda, first half of the session, I'll be going through changes to the Section J verification methods. I don't want to spend any time really comparing it to 2016, but essentially I'll tell you what the requirements are. And the second half of the session, I'll just be going through a bit of a fictional case study for a small office building in Canberra, and just trying to go through a pathway for which you could base your decision on whether to use JV1, JV2, JV3, and or JV4. So first, let's have a look at the compliance pathways that are available to you in order to ensure that you comply with the NCC Section J. So the compliance level, and this image is actually just taken from the ABCB website. What you actually legally need to comply with is the performance requirement. Now, under Section J, that would be your JP1. And it essentially is a statement of function and minimum requirements that is quite broad from a performance level of what you need to achieve. There are a few ways then that you could comply with that particular performance requirements. Okay, so you can either use a performance solution, and we'll go through what that means later on, where your actual attributes and design requirements are not quantified and qualified. Or you can use a deemed to satisfy solution. So that's where it actually says your HVAC system or your chillers needs to be X performance level. Your interior lighting needs to be this watts per square meters. So that's a prescribed pathway. So essentially, if I had to, I guess, redefine or rebatch your compliance pathway solutions are available to you. One is a performance solution and one is a prescriptive solution. So first, let's have a look at what the performance solutions actually refer to. So this will be covered under Part A of the section, not Section J, Part A of your National Construction Code. So it will be covered under Section A. And under Part A 2.2, it tells you that there are two criteria for you to meet the performance requirement. One is compliance with all the performance requirements. So if you've got JP1, in the 2016 code, we had JV3 as well, and then JP2, which was deleted somewhere along the line. Or you can prove equivalency to the deemed to satisfy solutions. Okay, but ultimately what you're trying to comply with is that performance requirement. The methods that could apply as a performance solutions are fourfold. Okay, so there's four ways you could do that. One is you could provide some sort of evidence of suitability as listed in Part A5. Sorry, to be honest, I can't remember what it is. Have a look at what Part A5 covers. You can use one of the verification methods. So it's still performance-based, which gives you as a designer more flexibility around what you want to prescribe or design your building to, especially if it doesn't meet the minimum requirements in the deemed to satisfy criteria. There are two things you could do there. One is you could use the ones that are in the National Construction Code itself. So today's session will go through the 4 that's available to you under Section J, or where you can provide evidence that your local planning authority has approved the verification method that you want to use. The third way that you could comply, or the third type of performance solution, is expert judgment. So that's where you can actually employ someone who is a recognized expert in the field. And I would actually counsel you and advise you to check in with your local planning authority or your jurisdiction just to confirm that the expert that you're planning to use is considered an expert according to the construction code. But they can actually write up a statement for you to say that they have assessed whatever deviation from, deemed to satisfy whatever your design is to meet the performance requirement. And finally, an acceptable performance solution is for you to do a comparison with the deemed to satisfy provision. So that's where you may differ a little bit, so you're not following it exactly, but you can demonstrate that it's equivalent performance level, for example. Okay, so let's switch back to Section J. The performance requirements, the legal requirement in Section J is actually JP1, which covers energy use. Most of the text is similar to what 2016 is. The key thing that I would actually bring out here is that there is a new provision under item F, where you need to demonstrate that if a space is conditioned, you achieve an hourly regulated energy consumption. So it only covers the equipment or components that are regulated within code. And of course, there's average over the annual hours of operation, and then you have separate kilojoules per square meters per hour requirements for class 6, so that's retail. You've got class 5, 7B, 8, 9A. So daytime use buildings, 43 kilojoules per square meters per hour. And then for all other building classifications, other than a sole occupancy unit in class 2, which are your apartments, the actual residences itself, at 15 kilojoules per square meters per hour. Okay, so that is a new, I guess, requirement covered under JP1. So we've talked about the performance requirement, and we've also talked about the ways that you can demonstrate compliance to the performance requirement. One, using performance solutions, which we're not focusing on today, but I've given you a quick rundown on how you could comply using performance solutions. And then we have either through the use of verification methods that are defined in the code itself under Section J, or the deemed to satisfy provisions. So there are 4 verification methods that is available to you under Section J. JV1, JV2, JV3, and JV4, which essentially now allows you to use NABERS Energy for Offices, your Green Star design and as built model and certification, as well as building envelope sealing. So these are all new to the 2019 code. So looking deeper into the 4 verification methods, we can roughly categorize them into 3 categories. The first category is something that is common to what we had in 2016, and that is you're comparing with a reference building, and that reference building is defined within the code, or if you're using Green Star, it was previously defined under what the greenhouse gas emissions and energy modeling guideline says the reference building needs to be. So you're comparing your proposed design to that reference building. And that approach is similar with some differences in detail for JV2 and JV3. We also have new categories for verification methods. And the first one is comparison to a performance rating. So that's when you take a NABERS pathway. So using JV1, which is a NABERS commitment agreement, which requires you to conduct energy and thermal modeling. Effectively, what you need to ensure you have is you have a 5.5-star NABERS commitment agreement signed, and that is administered through the NABERS administration, which is run by the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, DPIE. The third category that you have is more site focused, and that's more around ensuring install quality and build quality. So we all know about this, is to conduct a building tightness test. So that's where you're actually tackling only a small component, so not comparing the entire building. So there's lots of other provisions like mechanical equipment that you still need to comply with, but you can demonstrate compliance regarding the building ceiling and air tightness requirement using JV4. So that's where you actually do a blower door test. Just a reminder that this JV4 is not, none of these are actually requirements. It's up to you to use any combination of these to demonstrate compliance to your performance requirement. So JV4, which is your blower door test, is not compulsory. You could actually just demonstrate compliance with building ceiling using Part J3 requirements. When you're doing any thermal and energy modeling, so that's what you need to do for JV1, JV2, and JV3, there is a new requirement here, and that is to ensure that the software you're using complies to AIRAH 140. And essentially, AIRAH 140 provides a standard method of tests, a testing method to ensure or evaluate how robust your building energy analysis software is. One key thing I would bring up here to those on the call today, for those of you that are used to using ACATS, BSG, Camel, and previously you'll be using Beaver to demonstrate JV3 compliance, you won't be able to use Beaver anymore for Section J compliance under 2019. And part of that is because the Beaver program has said that they're not AIRAH 140 accredited, okay? So if you're using things like Design Builder, Energy Plus, or you're using IES or even TARS, you should be fine. Okay. So let's look at JV1 now. So JV1 is your NABERS energy for offices only. So what we've got here is we've got our 8 climate zones and we've got our building classes 2 to 9, which is our commercial buildings. You can use JV1 for all climate zones, but you can only use JV1 for offices currently. So there are considerations that are underway to consider if the other buildings that are rateable under NABERS energy would be included in JV1. But as it stands at the moment, you can only use it for a Class 5 office. The key thing here is you need to have signed a 5.5-star NABERS commitment agreement. And when you use JV1, your energy model that you've run in your software has to demonstrate that the base building greenhouse gas emissions are less than 67% of the 5.5-star level. So in addition to your NABERS commitment agreement, you also need to demonstrate a few other components. So that's where the 67% or less of that 5.5-star level applies. And what you do when you're doing that test is you exclude your tenant supplementary heating and cooling systems, you exclude your external lighting, and you exclude your car park services, which may sometimes be, if you're a NABERS assessor, you would know that sometimes they can be proportionally excluded or included. Okay. And finally, with JV1, you still have to ensure that thermal comfort is achieved in your proposed design. So you're not comparing your thermal comfort to to a reference building or anything. You just have to ensure that whatever design that you're putting in, you need to run the PMV calculations and ensure that it's PMV plus and minus 1 is achieved in more than 95% of occupied floor area, more than 98% of the time. time defined as the annual hours of operation. So this PMV requirement or thermal comfort requirement is consistent across JV1, 2, and 3, where you're expected to undertake energy and thermal modeling. JV2 covers Green Star. So this is where you actually register for a Green Star design and as-built rating. This applies similar to the NABERS pathway, JV1. It applies to all climate zones, but JV2 applies to a greater segment of building classes. So essentially, it covers all building classes except for class 4, which is where you've got a small little residential unit within a mixed-use building, commercial building. So the other thing to make note here is that for building class 2, so that's your apartments, JV2 only covers the common area. And actually that's no different from JV3, which we'll cover in the next slide, where class 2 modeling only covers the common area, obviously if it's conditioned. So JV2 is the method where you're comparing it with a reference building. What you need to demonstrate in addition to your registration for the design and as-built rating, and I think that if you're going for a Green Star rating, you can only register for 1 if you're targeting 4 stars and above. Okay, there's no registration for anything below. But you need to demonstrate that your annual greenhouse gas emissions for your proposed design or building is less than 90% of the reference building. Your PMV requirements as per JV1 still apply. So PMV plus or minus 1 in more than 95% of occupied zones, more than 98% of annual operational hours. JV3 is the other method where we compare to a reference building. That's probably where a lot of people are most familiar with in terms of Section J compliance. Similar to all the other verification methods, applies to all climate zones. And this time applies to all building classes, even for class 4, which is your residential and commercial buildings. I won't go through too much detail here because with JV3, you would basically have all of your requirements contained within the Section J of your National Construction Code, and you would need to comply to specification JVA, JVB, and JVC. Okay, so it tells you what all your modeling parameters are. Finally, for JV4, this is where we cover building envelope sealing. You can do it across all climate zones, okay, but it depends on what building class you're doing this test for. So in orange here, I've noted the ones, I've mapped against the climate zones and which building classes they're relevant to, okay? So if you were looking at building class 2 or building class 4, you can use JV4 in all climate zones, okay? And the requirement is when you do your blower door test that you meet 10 cubic meters per hour per square meters. And the building tightness, the blower door test is done in accordance as a standard, which is the ISO 9972, and it's method 1 in that standard. So you just have to cross check that your blower door tester is aware of that and doing the right test. Now, if you're looking at more standard commercial type buildings where you're looking at office, class 6 retail, class 8, you know, your labs or your hospitals or your schools, you can only use JV4 for climate zones 1, 7, and 8. And part of that is because for some of the other climate zones, the original analysis found that sometimes having infiltration could be net positive for energy for these building types. And so what we were able to put through following a cost benefit analysis was only to have this requirement valid for climate zones 1, 7, and 8, which are the more extreme climate zones. So for these ones here, the requirement is 5 cubic meters per hour per square meters at 50 pascals. One way to describe these building classes are that they are daytime use building. All right, so for 9A, this requirement excludes the ward areas. For overnight buildings or night use buildings, we've got Class 3 hotels, Class 9A wards, and Class 9C aged care, for example. You have more climate zones that you can use this for. Climate zone, actually all of the climate zones except for climate zone 2, so that's your Brisbane, for example, and climate zone 5, which is your Sydney, Perth, Adelaide. The air tightness or air permeability requirement is still the same as your daytime use building, which is 5 cubic meters per hour per square meters. What are some other requirements that you need to comply with if you're using either JV1, JV2, or JV3? So that's where you're conducting energy modeling. So you have to comply to specification JVA, and essentially that covers additional compliance items for construction quality and build quality. Also covers things like controls that doesn't necessarily get reflected in some of the modeling work that is done. So for JV1, for example, if you used it, specification JVA says that you have to your tenant supplementary heating and cooling system, your car park ventilation and lighting, and your HVAC equipment that's not covered within a base building rating has to comply with the deemed to satisfy provisions. Okay. For JV2, it says that any HVAC or artificial lighting that's not covered under your Green Star model will need to comply to your deemed to satisfy requirements. Specification JVB tells you what the modeling parameters need to be for your reference building and for your proposed building. It tells you what needs to be same, and it tells you what probably doesn't need to be the same as well. So specification JVB is designed to be quite flexible, especially now we are adding in NABERS pathways and the Green Star pathways, which we know that those rating schemes have their own modeling guidelines. So under JVB, it says that things like operational profiles and all, you can use either JVB or the NABERS guidelines or the Green Star guidelines, essentially. Okay. So there's some flexibility there, but you also need to be careful because with the Green Star method and their guidelines, we know that they actually define things like HVAC systems, or they define default equipment for, say, domestic hot water and things like that. Whereas for Section J compliance, there are specific requirements around what needs to be the same between the proposed building and the reference building. For example, controls, okay, of equipment, they need to be largely similar. So there are certainly some differences between the modeling guidelines for Green Star and specification JVB that you need to be careful of, okay? Okay. There are some additional items if you were a modeler by trade. Just be clear that with the controls strategies, you need to ensure that both the reference building and the proposed buildings have variable temperature controls for both your chilled water and hot water systems. So you can't have your reference building running a chilled water plant and hot water plant with very inefficient constant temperature designs. Where your proposed buildings don't have any controls specified at the time that you're doing your modeling, you have to use the AIRAH application guideline DA 28, which covers BMS controls in your actual model. All right. Other items that are probably, I guess, that you're more familiar with are that for your plant efficiency, so your HVAC plant, for example, you need to consider how the impact of ambient temperatures, for example, or condenser water temperatures will impact your plant efficiency. So it's not enough to just state a single COP. So quickly moving through our case study now. So the background is this is a small office building, class 5, 1,500 square meters, located in Canberra, so climate zone 7. We have the owner that's considering whether they should actually they are considering going forward with a base building NABERS rating energy target of 5.5 stars and a 4-star Green Star design and as built rating. And part of it's because with the NABERS rating, they already want to go for it to advertise, I guess, to advertise the market so that they can actually lease that space. So the question that they have to you is which verification method should they use, if they should use it. So let's have a look at JV1 if they were to use this. So the text is quite small here, but it will be available in your in Ecolibrium. But if you were to go through a JV1 or a NABERS pathway, the first thing you need to do, so in blue, is you need to register for a base building NABERS commitment agreement. Now, there are two things to note here. One is a NABERS commitment agreement is a legal document. So you have to sign a contract that is legally binding. And it legally binds whoever who applies for it, and typically that's the owner, your client, to achieve the agreed target NABERS rating. In addition to that, you also have to pay a NABERS administration fee. So as of last year, it was about $7,000, including GST. So you always just need to check the NABERS website for current fees. Once they've done that, they'll need to engage a modeler to conduct energy and thermal comfort modeling in accordance to the full construction design. Okay, so that's what NABERS requirements. So in blue are all the things that you need to do as standard NABERS requirements. So the modeler will need to use the NABERS handbook to determine modeling requirements. It tells you how you model and set up your profiles and your HVAC plant and lighting and all. In yellow are the ones that you have to achieve Section J requirements. So number one, the modeling software needs to meet ASHRAE standard 140. That's actually the same as NABERS requirements. So I'm just highlighting it to show you that they actually align. And as I mentioned, there are some software that you probably can't use, such as the ACAS BSG Viva program. For Section J compliance, this is in addition to the NABERS requirements, you have to prove that your base building greenhouse gas emissions are less than 67% of your 5.5-star NABERS performance level once you exclude some of these systems. So you've got your tenant supplementary heating and cooling systems, your external lighting and car park services. In addition to that, if you've proven that, you also need to prove that the thermal comfort level in the form of predicted mean vote, PMV, so you can just extract that usually from your software, is plus and minus 1 across more than 95% of floor area in all occupied zones for more than 98% of annual hours of operation of the building. This is typically an extraction and then some spreadsheet work. Now, I know that there are plugins out there currently that you could use to support this calculation. But predominantly, this is a mixture of spreadsheet work and your software outputs. Now, let's jump back into the process. So if you were going through a NABERS commitment agreement, once you've done that modeling, you actually need to engage an independent design review IDR panel member to review the design and the modeling report to ensure that it's in line with NABERS principles. And essentially, it's a risk assessment that this panel member does to determine whether or not this building or design is likely to achieve its target or committed NABERS rating or not. So if it was 5.5 stars, the IDR may reveal that there are issues that need to be rectified. So you can see the arrows here. This is a bit of an iterative or feedback loop. So you keep going through that process until the IDR panel member is happy, essentially, and it goes through to the next stage, which goes back to NABERS. NABERS would then assign that NABERS commitment agreement certificate for 5.5 stars, because you need that minimum to use JV1 base building energy rating. Once you have that certificate, that's fine. You submit that as part of your Section J compliance. You then put in additional documentation to prove that you comply with specification JVA requirements. There is a few sets of them to do with building quality. I wouldn't add them in here because they are common across all of it. But the one that you should take notice of is For JV1 method, if you haven't included tenant supplementary heating and cooling systems, car park ventilation and lighting, and any HVAC systems or lighting systems, they have to comply with DTS requirements. Once you can prove all those in yellow, you achieve Section J compliance, which is great for Section J, but from your client perspective, they've signed a commitment agreement, which means that once the building has been handed over and is in operation, they are still required to conduct a NABERS base building energy rating to certify that the building has achieved the committed target rating. So this is typically about 12 months post practical completion or more if they've proven that they can't achieve that commitment level. All right, and each time you do a NABERS rating, there'll be NABERS assessor fees as well as certification fees. So a few notes on JV1. It's obviously subject to the BEAD Act. So we know that under commercial building disclosure, if you were more than 1,000 square meters, you would need a NABERS rating. If you wanted to advertise a building, you would need a NABERS rating for an office building. Including if your building hasn't been built yet and you want to advertise it's capable of achieving a certain NABERS level, then you need that commitment agreement certificate. Now, the good thing about JV1 is you only need one energy model because you're not doing comparison. All right, so from the perspective, so going back to our case study here, we've done a quick check to say, yep, they've got their 5.5-star commitment agreement certificate. That's a tick. They have documentation that proves what that the software they're using has been certified against ASHRAE standard 140. They've proven the base building CO2 emissions for that 67% threshold. They also have proven in the secondary report that thermal comfort requirements are achieved, and also additional proof that specification JVA requirements are met. So all compliant, and that's great, you can use it. If they were to use JV2, it'll be a similar process. In blue are your standard Green Star requirements. In yellow are the ones that your Section J requirements cover. So starting the process, if you were to use JV2, you need to register for a Green Star Design and as built, currently version 1.3 rating. All right, so you do that with the GBCA, noting that there is a certification fee. Now, the GBCA certification fee is not a fixed value. It typically depends on what your project contract value is. So, for example, if you had contract value of less than $1 million, then the fee for certification would range between $9,000 to $15,000, including GST, okay, as of last year. Once you've registered for it, you then need to prepare the Green Star Design and as built submission templates or documentation. That is actually quite extensive. So with Green Star, if they were to use JV2, outside of Section J compliance, which only covers energy credits, Green Star Design and as built actually covers management, indoor environment quality, transport, water materials, land use and ecology categories that you all need to collect documentation for. All right, and for you to get at least 4 stars, you need at least 45% of available points, okay? And so as part of this, you also need to probably engage and that will pay for a GSAP or a Green Star accredited professional to assist the team in pulling together documentation. So you can see here where this pathway sort of splits out into 2. The first one up there is all the other target credits in other categories that they're aiming for will need documentation prepared for. So there's additional cost and time with that. For the Section J's compliance component, actually is covered under the energy category, all right, and the greenhouse gas emissions credit. So for Section J compliance, you just need to target the conditional credits and engage a modeler to conduct the energy and thermal comfort modeling. So there is a guideline that Green Star has to determine the modeling requirements. For Section J compliance, you then need to ensure that the modeling parameters meet specification JVB. Now, this may actually affect how you define your reference building and how you define your proposed building. So keep this in mind if you're using JV2 to comply. Secondly, your modeling software has to meet ASHRAE standard 140. It's the same as all the other JV methods, as well as the thermal comfort level. That's the same. For the greenhouse gas emissions, you have to prove that your proposed building uses less than 90% of your reference building. The reference building is as defined in specification JVB, not as defined in the Green Star Guide. Once you've got all those documentation and modeling completed, then you need to submit the documents to GPCA so you can obtain a Green Star registration certification email. All right. Once you've done that, you've got additional, just prove that you meet the additional specification JVA requirements. And for any requirements that are not specifically included under your Green Star model, then you just need to prove that it meets DTS requirements. If you can prove all those in yellow, then you achieve Section J compliance. So outside of Section J compliance for your building and from your owner perspective, there are still things they need to do once the building has been handed over and is in operation. So once the building is in operation, they need to actually undergo the proper certification. So all the supporting documentation to achieve at least 4 stars for our case study building to ensure that their Green Star design and as built rating is certified. It doesn't matter from an operational perspective for Section J compliance, whether it's met or not. Section J compliance only goes up to the extent of where these yellow boxes are and where this star is. Okay, so this slide just shows you basically JV2 only covers energy and you need at least 45% of points. So this table here is similar to with JV1. We're just going through the steps to making sure that we comply with the Section J requirement. This is also an Ecolibrium. JV3, okay. JV3 is your comparison with a reference building method. So a note here regarding our case study building. So our building here is only 1,500 square meters, so it's tiny. And actually, to be honest, it already meets all of the DTS requirements in parts J1 to J8. So actually, there's no real requirement to conduct additional JV3 modeling. However, if the building fabric is adjusted, for example, you know, if your client wants to go for curtain walling with very high window to wall ratio, so or they want to increase their window U value or SA solar heat gain coefficient, and therefore they deviate from deemed to satisfy requirements, then they may want to consider using JV3. But otherwise, usually with a building this small, you'll find that you can more than often meet your Section J compliance using DTS. JV4, if we would consider using it for this building, all right? So with this building, in the case study, we've actually said that the owners or builders, sorry, already plan to undertake building tightness test, and they're using the ISO 9972 method 1. And essentially what that means is that when you do the test, you don't have any natural ventilation, and you're just introducing air into the building and forcing air into the building using the blower doors or blower fans. So in Canberra, your requirement that we need to meet is 5 cubic meters per hour per square meters at 50 pascals. They are using an ATMA accredited tester, so that's important. And they already plan to conduct a rate pan test, okay? So essentially, they are marking up all the areas where they want to ensure that it's airtight. So what does this mean? If we put that all together and form it into a decision-making framework, we can start up the top and ask the question for our case study building, which is a 1,500 square meter office building in Canberra. Does the building have a sustainability target? Yes, it does, essentially, because they're already planning to go for a NABERS rating, as well as potentially a Green Star design and as built rating. So if it's a yes, then we need to ask the question of whether they only have an energy target rating only, or are they actually seeking other sustainability targets beyond just energy? If they're seeking only an energy target and they are comfortable with going through the NABERS commitment agreement, accounting for all the operational requirements that extend far beyond Section J compliance, then yes, they should register for a NABERS commitment agreement. And actually, they can just use JV1 to prove compliance because they're already doing a model. If the building has a sustainability target that transcends beyond just energy, then the question to ask here, and this arrow is the other way around, is does the building have a Green Star design and as-built target? If they say yes, then the question is to ask if the building has registered for a Green Star design and as-built rating. If it does, then we need to ask the question of your client whether the additional cost to modify a Green Star reference model, just to make sure that it complies with section JV specification JVB requirements, is feasible. If they say yes, then you would use the JV2 pathway essentially. If they say no, then we need to go back and consider, so this red line here to either, if the building meets all DTS requirements, okay, in part J1 to J8. So I mentioned earlier on a couple of slides before, that's quite a small building, so more than likely it really complies with DTS. If it does, then of course we use the DTS pathway. If they don't, then we need to use JV3 pathway or any other performance solutions. One last question to ask here is if the building intends to undertake an air tightness test. The reason for that is because under specification JVA, it requires that part J3, which covers building ceiling requirements, are met separately. So if there's already intending to conduct an air tightness test, then we just need to cross-check if the building class and climate zone is eligible for JV4. If it is, then we can use JV4 to demonstrate compliance with JP1E, which is to do with building ceiling. And if not, then if they weren't intending to undertake an air tightness test, then in addition to using either JV1, JV2, or JV3 or DTS, you just need to ensure that your DTS requirements in part J3 is covered. So ultimately, the decision of your client whether they should be using a verification method, which verification method, depends on what their leasing arrangements are. If they saw value in perhaps using a NABERS rating or Green Star rating to advertise for tenants. If they do, then there's definitely value in going through with JV1 and JV2 because you're already spending all that money and ready to take it through to operation, all the requirements surrounding a NABERS commitment agreement and a Green Star design as-built rating. If the building is subject to the BEAT Act, so that covers the requirement for NABERS energy ratings to be conducted for all buildings over 1,000 square meters, then more than likely this makes it easy because during operational phase, these buildings already need to undertake a NABERS rating. So the question is really just around that design stage of whether or not they want to conduct one is sign a NABERS commitment agreement, but also conduct additional modeling to prove that. And finally, with air tightness test, it's really a good method to prove construction quality. So we will always recommend doing that. But if not, then perhaps JV4 would not be a method that you undertake. Okay. So in conclusion, today I've just gone through the NCC compliance framework, gone through a few notes on how you apply the Section J verification methods, and also giving you a quick framework that you could use to make your decisions. Okay, Marie.
Thank you, Grace. So we might move over to Q&A now.
Sure. Okay, so I think a question from Angus is, if we're using the NABERS verification method, is the tenant or the office floor plate lighting included in the methodology? No, it would not be included under your base building NABERS energy model, but that's why you need to ensure that it meets the DTS requirement. So what NABERS uses is it would get you to, I guess, model the expected heating load introduced by your tenant equipment for your base building energy rating. But to demonstrate compliance, you will need to demonstrate that it meets DTS requirements in part J6 or apply a performance solution to demonstrate that.
Seems like you've covered everything off, Grace, today. No questions for you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think if there's no other further questions, we might wrap things up there. So thank you everybody for registering and attending today's Streamline session. Special thanks to you, Grace, as well for conducting the presentation. The webinar has been recorded and we will be posting up the recording up on the AIRAH webpage over the coming days. And I'll send out an email to you guys and let you know when that does become available as well. To view or register for any of AIRAH's other upcoming Streamline sessions, hopefully you can see them on your screen there. We have a couple coming up in April and registrations for these will be open in the coming days as well. So thank you everybody again, and I look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you. Thanks, Grace.